I want to talk to you today about the quarantine protocol from the MWISD COVID-19 plan. There are two main reasons why a person might have to quarantine at home and stay away from school. The first reason has to do with exposure. You've been in close contact with someone who has tested positive for COVID-19. This type of quarantine gives you time to see if you have caught the virus or not. The second reason has to do with illness. You have symptoms of COVID-19 or you have actually tested positive for the virus. This type of quarantine gives you time to recover from the virus, so you only return to school when you are no longer contagious. It's important to note that the length of quarantine is different for exposure versus recovery. So this is a little confusing for everyone, but the length of quarantine for a person who actually has contracted COVID-19 is shorter than the length of a quarantine for a person who has been exposed. Why is this? Well, when you have COVID-19, it very often takes 10 days for the disease to run its course and for you to stop being contagious. You would only be able to come back to school after 10 days if your symptoms have receded and you've been without fever for at least 24 hours without the use of fever-reducing medications. If you're quarantining due to exposure, you have to wait longer, 14 days to be exact. Why longer? Because the way the virus works is there's an incubation period. You sometimes don't get COVID-19 the day you are exposed or the next day after you were exposed. Sometimes it takes up to 14 days for the virus to incubate and then infect your body. So let's talk about the 14-day quarantine for someone who's been exposed to COVID-19. What is exposure? Exposure is caused by any one of three things. Close contact with an infected person is the first one. Close contact is if any time during the last 14 days you've been within 6 feet of a person who has been lab confirmed to have COVID-19 and one or the other of you wasn't wearing a face covering and you were within 6 feet of them for a cumulative duration of 15 or more minutes. That's cumulative across the time period that they're infectious. When are they infectious? From 2 days before their symptoms appear to 10 days after their symptoms appear. A second way you can be exposed to COVID-19 is through direct secretion. This is when a person who is lab confirmed to have COVID-19 coughs or sneezes on you and one or the other of you wasn't wearing a mask. This would have to occur during their infectious period and it would have to have happened during the last 14 days. Now there's another thing called assumed exposure. This is exactly the same thing as close contact, except in this case, the close contact was with someone who has COVID-19 symptoms but can't or won't go take a test to see if they're positive. If this happens to you, you should assume the person was positive and go into quarantine. In all of these cases of exposure or assumed exposure, you will need to quarantine for 14 days. If someone in your household, like a spouse or a child, has been exposed, it does not follow that you are automatically exposed. If they're awaiting testing, you may continue to report to school or work, but you would be required to report directly to the nurse's office each morning for a temperature check. If that person in your household later tests positive, you would need to begin a 14-day quarantine after your last close contact with that person during their infectious period. After your 14-day quarantine is over, you may return to school unless you've begun showing symptoms or tested positive for COVID-19 yourself. If you're quarantining for 14 days due to exposure and you begin to show symptoms of COVID-19, you would need to get tested if you can. If you test positive or you're unable to test, you would need to begin the 10-day quarantine for symptomatic or COVID-positive individuals, which we'll talk about next. So that's it for the 14-day incubation quarantine. Let's talk about the 10-day recovery quarantine. If you're lab confirmed to have COVID-19 or you have symptoms of COVID-19, you need to stay away from school property and quarantine for 10 days. You should stay home and not entertain visitors during this period. You should only leave the house for medical appointments. You should use a separate bathroom if possible and clean it very well after each use. You should isolate yourself from the rest of your family for the 10 days if that is at all possible. So what are the symptoms of COVID-19? COVID-19 symptoms are the following: feeling feverish or having a temperature measured at greater than or equal to 100.0 degrees, loss of taste or smell, cough, difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, fatigue, headache, chills, sore throat, congestion or runny nose, shaking or exaggerated shivering, significant muscle pain or ache, diarrhea, nausea, or vomiting. Now, for these symptoms to be symptoms of COVID-19, they have to be unusual for the person experiencing them. So if you have allergies and often have a runny nose, that would not automatically be considered a COVID-19 symptom. After the 10 days of your recovery quarantine are over, you may return to school or work only if you meet all the following criteria. Number 1, you've been fever-free without medications for at least 24 hours. And number 2, you have improvement in your COVID-related symptoms. And number 3, it's been at least 10 days since your symptoms first appeared. If you have COVID-19 symptoms but want to return to work or school sooner than the 10 days, you can return if you either obtain a doctor's note stating that you don't have COVID-19 and clearing you for return based on an alternative diagnosis, or upon receiving a negative COVID-19 test from an approved testing site. I hope this explanation of the MWISD quarantine protocol helps you out. At Mineral Wells Independent School District, we take the safety of our students and staff very seriously. Thank you for all that you're doing to help us keep our Rams healthy and learning.